Clean faster. Some of us have real jobs." The words landed sharp and cold, slicing through the polished air of the 42nd floor boardroom as a few quiet chuckles rippled across the glass table. Naomi Brooks didn't look up, her hands steady on the mop handle, the faint scent of lemon cleaner rising beneath the glow of recessed lights, her reflection stretching across the marble floor like something meant to disappear. Around her, tailored suits shifted in their seats. Screens flickered with a $200 million acquisition model, and at the head of the table stood Richard Holloway, a man who measured worth in margins and silence, his cufflinks catching the light as he gestured impatiently toward a smudge only he seemed to see. Naomi moved without a word, each step soft, controlled, her sneakers whispering against the floor while the room resumed its rhythm of numbers, projections, and confident assumptions. But her eyes, calm and observant, had already scanned the spreadsheet reflected upside down in the glass wall, had already caught the misalignment buried deep in the forecast, a quiet imbalance no one else seemed to notice. She paused just long enough to glance again, just long enough for the tension in her chest to tighten, then exhaled slowly, choosing her words with care. "Sir, that model doesn't hold if the liability shifts after Q3, she said, her voice low but clear, and the room didn't just quiet. It stalled, like a machine missing a gear. A few heads turned, brows furrowing. One executive let out a short laugh as if correcting the moment back into place. But Richard didn't smile. Not yet. He just looked at her, really looked this time, taking in the uniform, the name tag, the mop, the audacity. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice even, almost curious, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. Naomi held his gaze for a fraction longer than expected, then nodded toward the screen. "The risk exposure compounds. It looks stable now, but it won't stay that way." And for a second, just a second, the flicker of doubt passed across one of the analyst's faces before it vanished under the weight of hierarchy. Someone shifted in their chair, another whispered something under their breath, and then Richard gave a small, dismissive chuckle, the kind that reset the room back to its order. "I think you're out of your depth," he said lightly, turning back to the table as if the interruption had already been erased. "Let's stay focused." And just like that, the conversation resumed, louder now, faster, as if speed could bury what had just happened. Naomi lowered her eyes again, stepping back, the mop gliding across the floor in slow, deliberate strokes, but her heartbeat didn't match the room's rhythm anymore. It carried something steadier, something unshaken. Near the doorway, a security staff member shifted his weight, waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet, while the numbers on the screen kept moving forward toward a decision no one questioned. Naomi reached the edge of the room and paused, just for a breath, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass like a silent witness, sunlight catching on distant windows, reflecting back into the space where no one was looking at her anymore. And still, something in the air felt off, like a sentence unfinished, like a truth waiting its turn to be heard. Naomi stepped into the service hallway, the hum of the boardroom fading behind her like a door closing on something unfinished, her grip loosening slightly on the mop as the fluorescent lights above flickered in a steady, indifferent rhythm. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and metal, a sharp contrast to the polished silence she had just left, and for a moment she stood still, listening to her own breathing, slow and controlled, the way her mother had taught her when things felt too heavy to carry. She moved again, pushing the cart forward, the wheels squeaking softly with every turn, her mind replaying the numbers she had seen reflected on that glass wall, the imbalance, the quiet flaw hidden beneath confident assumptions, the kind of mistake that did not show itself until it was too late. At the far end of the corridor, a small window let in a strip of sunlight, cutting across the floor and catching the edge of her name tag. Naomi Brooks, the letters worn but still clear. Still hers. She paused there, just for a second, her reflection faint in the glass, layered over the city beyond, towers rising in clean lines, each one holding decisions made by people who never noticed the ones who kept their floors shining. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, a soft vibration against her hip, and she hesitated before pulling it out, the screen lighting up with a single message that had arrived minutes earlier. Unknown sender, no introduction, just a time and a room number. 2:15 p.m., conference room B. Naomi stared at it, her brow tightening slightly, then glanced back toward the direction of the boardroom, where voices still carried faintly through the walls, sharper now, less certain, a shift in tone that most people would miss, but she did not. She slipped the phone back into her pocket without replying, her fingers lingering there for a brief moment as if weighing something unseen, then exhaled and continued down the hall, her steps measured, unhurried, inside the boardroom. The conversation had changed, the easy confidence replaced by quiet interruptions, an analyst scrolling back through the model, another leaning closer to the screen, a question asked once, then again, louder this time, while Richard stood at the head of the table, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he watched the numbers no longer behave the way they were supposed to. A faint crease formed between his brows, the first crack in a surface that rarely showed strain, and though no one said her name, the echo of her words lingered in the room like something unfinished. Down the hallway, Naomi reached the service elevator and pressed the button, the soft chime breaking the silence as the doors slid open, revealing the mirrored interior, clean and empty. Waiting, she stepped inside, her reflection meeting her again, not as someone invisible, but as someone who knew exactly what she had seen and exactly what it meant. Her posture straightening just slightly as the doors began to close, the narrow gap framing the hallway, the light, the quiet, and then sealing it all away as the elevator started its descent, carrying her toward a moment that had not yet revealed itself but was already in motion. The elevator doors opened, with a soft chime onto the 27th floor, quieter, dimmer, where the hum of executive urgency had not yet reached, and Naomi stepped out with the same steady pace, her cart rolling behind her as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. The carpet here softened her footsteps, absorbing sound, absorbing presence, the kind of floor designed so decisions could be made without interruption. And for a moment, she let her hand rest on the cart handle, feeling the faint vibration of the building itself, a structure built on certainty that now, somewhere above, had begun to crack. Her phone buzzed again, sharper this time, and she did not ignore it, pulling it out as she walked past a row of closed glass offices, each one empty, each one reflecting her movement back at her in fragments. The message had changed, no longer just a time and a room, but a name now, her name, Naomi Brooks, followed by a single line, "Please be on time," and below it, a company's signature she recognized. Instantly, not from cleaning schedules or maintenance logs, but from something older, something buried deeper than this building, something tied to long nights under a different kind of light. She stopped walking. The cart rolled half an inch forward before settling, the wheels aligning as if even they understood the pause. Naomi read the message again, slower, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in confusion, but in confirmation, as if a pattern she had seen before was finally revealing its full shape. Somewhere above, in that boardroom, voices rose again, sharper now, overlapping, a question turning into a concern into urgency. And inside that space, Richard stood still for a moment longer than usual, his hand resting on the edge of the table, eyes locked on a section of the model that refused to balance, the numbers repeating Naomi's warning in silent defiance. An analyst cleared his throat, suggested a recalculation, another proposed a delay, but the confidence that had filled the room earlier had thinned, replaced by something more fragile, something that could not be controlled with a simple command. Richard straightened, adjusting his jacket, but the movement lacked its usual precision, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door, toward the place where Naomi had stood, where her voice had interrupted the script he was used to following. Back on the 27th floor, Naomi turned slowly, leaving the cart where it was, the mop leaning against the bucket like an unfinished sentence, and began walking in the opposite direction, toward conference room B, her steps light but deliberate, each one carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. The hallway stretched ahead, long and still, the overhead lights reflecting softly on the polished walls, and as she approached the room, the door already slightly open, she could see the edge of a screen glowing inside, the outline of a table set not for cleaning, but for something else entirely. She paused at the threshold, her hand resting against the doorframe, feeling the cool surface beneath her fingers, grounding herself in the moment. Then took a slow breath and stepped inside. The air. Different here, less rushed, more intentional, like a space waiting for truth instead of performance. And as the door closed quietly behind her, the faint echo of the boardroom chaos above seemed to follow, distant but growing, as if the building itself was holding its breath for what would happen next. The room was already prepared before she stepped fully inside. The long table aligned with quiet precision, a single screen glowing at the far wall, and two figures seated across from each other who did not look up immediately, as if they had been expecting her without needing to confirm it. Naomi closed the door gently behind her, the soft click settling into the stillness, and for a moment no one spoke, the air holding that same pause she had felt earlier, only this time it was not dismissal. It was recognition waiting to take shape. She moved forward slowly, her footsteps measured against the carpet, her eyes adjusting to the subtle shift in lighting. Warmer here, less clinical, more intentional. The man closest to the screen finally lifted his gaze, mid-50s, composed, the kind of presence that did not need volume to command attention, and he nodded once, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming something already decided. "You made quite an impression upstairs," he said, his voice calm, even, carrying none of the edge she had heard before, and Naomi did not respond immediately, her attention drawn instead to the document displayed behind him. The same model, but paused, highlighted, sections marked in red where imbalance had begun to surface. She stepped closer, just enough to see clearly, her eyes scanning the data with quiet familiarity, not rushed, not hesitant, as if this space, this language of numbers and consequence, had always belonged to her even when no one had asked. "They are starting to see it," the woman across the table added, her tone measured, observant, fingers resting lightly on a tablet as she watched Naomi rather than the screen, studying not just what she knew, but how she carried it. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders settling, the tension from earlier not gone, but reshaped into something steadier, something anchored. "It is already too late to adjust without exposure," she said finally, her voice clear, controlled, and the two figures exchanged a brief glance, not surprised, but affirmed. The man leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "That is why you are here," he replied, and the words did not feel like an invitation. They felt like a reveal. Naomi's gaze shifted from the screen to him, then to the folder placed at the center of the table. Unopened, her name printed across the front in clean, precise lettering, Naomi Brooks, external risk consultant, the ink sharp against the white surface. For a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single detail, the distance between who she had been perceived as and who she was now no longer abstract, but visible, undeniable. She stepped forward, reaching out, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder, feeling the weight of it, not just paper, but acknowledgement, timing, consequence. Upstairs, the tension continued to rise, voices overlapping, a decision no longer steady, and Richard stood at the head of the table, silent now, listening to the room unravel in small, controlled ways, each question pointing back to the same flaw he had dismissed minutes earlier. Back in conference room B, Naomi lifted the folder slowly, opening it just enough to confirm what she already understood, then closed it again, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if the shift happening around her was not sudden, but inevitable. The woman across from her watched closely, then gave a slight nod. "They will call for you," she said, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, and Naomi did not ask when, she did not ask why. She simply stood there, holding the folder, listening to the quiet, knowing that somewhere above, the moment was already moving toward her. Upstairs, the rhythm of the room had broken completely, no longer controlled, no longer smooth. Voices overlapping in uneven waves as the projection flickered between tabs, each recalculation exposing something deeper, something no one could easily explain away. An analyst leaned forward, his voice tight. "The liability curve is not stabilizing," while another shook his head, scrolling faster, searching for a correction that would not come. And at the center of it all, Richard stood still, his hand resting flat against the polished table, the surface reflecting a version of him that looked composed but no longer certain. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the room itself understood the cost of being wrong at this level, in this space, at this scale. Someone suggested postponing the vote. Another mentioned legal exposure, the words stacking quickly, each one carrying weight, and still, no one said what had already been said minutes earlier by a voice they had dismissed. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze drifting again toward the door, toward the empty space where Naomi had stood, the echo of her calm interruption now louder than any voice in the room. "Who cleared this model?" he asked finally, his tone controlled, but sharper now, and no one answered immediately, not because they did not know, but because the question itself had shifted, no longer about process, but about accountability. Downstairs, the quiet in conference room remained intact, untouched by the rising tension above. Naomi standing near the table, the folder still in her hands, her posture steady, her breathing even, as if she had already stepped outside the urgency that consumed the rest of the building. The man across from her glanced briefly at his watch, then back at her, not impatient, not concerned, simply aware of timing, of sequence, of the exact moment when recognition would no longer be optional. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief second, not in hesitation, but in reflection, her fingers adjusting slightly on the edge of the folder, feeling the subtle texture of the paper beneath her skin, grounding herself in something real, something earned. Above, a decision was unraveling. Below, a truth was waiting to be acknowledged. A notification chimed softly on the tablet in front of the woman seated at the table, her eyes scanning it quickly before lifting again to Naomi. A faint shift in her expression, almost imperceptible, but enough. "It is time," she said quietly, and the words did not rush the moment. They aligned it. Naomi nodded once, not surprised, not rushed, then turned toward the door, her movement smooth, deliberate, each step carrying a quiet weight that no longer needed permission. The hallway outside felt the same as before, but different now, as if the building itself had shifted slightly, adjusting to a new center of gravity. The elevator doors opened without delay, as if already called, already waiting, and Naomi stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting her not as someone passing through, but as someone arriving. As the doors closed, the faint echo of raised voices above seemed to draw closer, not louder, but clearer, and when the elevator began to rise, floor by floor, the distance between who she had been seen as and who she was about to become narrowed with every second, until finally, the soft chimes sounded again, and the doors began to open back onto the floor where everything had started, where nothing was the same anymore. The elevator doors opened slowly, almost silently, and Naomi stepped out into the same corridor she had left minutes earlier, but the air felt different now, heavier, charged with something unspoken, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. The glass walls reflected movement, quick, unsettled, figures pacing, voices no longer contained behind closed doors, and as she walked forward, the distant sound of raised tones sharpened into words, fragments of concern, disbelief, recalculations that refused to settle. Her steps remained steady, measured, her hand resting lightly against the folder she carried now instead of the mop, the shift subtle but absolute, as if the weight she held had changed shape without changing purpose. Near the entrance to the boardroom, she slowed, not out of hesitation, but awareness, her eyes catching the reflection of the room before she fully reached it. A dozen figures no longer composed, screens filled with red markers, numbers circled, arrows drawn in urgency. Inside, Richard stood slightly off-center now, no longer anchored to the head of the table, his posture still upright, but less certain, his gaze moving between the data and the people who could no longer give him simple answers. A voice cut through. This exposure could reach 80 million within 12 months, and the room fell into a brief, heavy silence, the kind that does not ask for permission, it demands acknowledgement. Naomi reached the door just as it opened from the inside, an assistant stepping out quickly, almost colliding with her before stopping short, surprise flashing across his face as recognition struggled to form. As if he could not reconcile the image in front of him with the role he had assigned minutes earlier, she did not react, did not step back. She simply waited, her presence quiet but immovable, until he moved aside without a word. Inside, the conversation continued, but the rhythm had slowed, each sentence now weighed before spoken, each conclusion uncertain. Naomi stepped in, the door closing softly behind her, and for a moment, no one noticed, their focus still locked on the unraveling model, on the mistake that refused to stay hidden. Then someone did notice, a glance toward the back of the room, a pause mid-sentence, and slowly, like a ripple moving across water, attention began to shift, one by one, eyes turning, recognition catching up too late. Richard followed the movement, his gaze lifting from the screen to the doorway, and when he saw her standing there, not with a mop, not with lowered eyes, but with calm, grounded certainty, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough. Naomi did not speak. She did not interrupt. She simply walked forward, each step quiet against the polished floor, the sound of it barely audible but impossible to ignore. The folder in her hand resting against her side like a statement that did not need to be announced. The room held its breath without realizing it, the tension no longer chaotic but focused, drawn toward a single point. A single presence that had already spoken once and had been dismissed. Now, she stood closer to the table, the screen's light reflecting softly across her face, her eyes steady, not challenging, not apologizing, simply present. No one laughed this time, no one whispered, and in that silence, the earlier moment returned, clearer, sharper, no longer something to brush aside, but something that had been waiting to be understood, and now, finally, could not be ignored. For a long second, no one spoke, the silence stretching across the boardroom like a line no one wanted to cross, until finally one of the senior analysts cleared his throat, his voice quieter now, less certain. You said the liability shifts after Q3, and the words hung there, not as a question, but as a reopening of something they had already dismissed. Naomi did not rush to answer, her gaze moving to the screen, then to the table, then briefly to Richard, not confrontational, not hesitant, just steady, as if she were aligning herself with the truth rather than the room. She stepped closer, placing the folder gently on the edge of the table, the soft sound of paper against polished wood echoing louder than it should have, and with one smooth motion, she opened it, turning it toward them, revealing annotated pages, marked sections. Projections recalculated with precision that did not need explanation to be understood. It does not just shift, she said calmly, her voice even, carrying across the room without effort. It compounds, and once it crosses that threshold, it becomes irreversible. Within the structure you approved, and as she spoke, the screen behind them seemed to confirm every word, the numbers aligning not with their expectations, but with her quiet correction. One of the executives leaned forward, eyes narrowing, scanning the documents in front of her, flipping a page. Then another, her expression tightening as realization replaced doubt. This matches the discrepancy, she murmured, almost to herself, and another voice followed. How did we miss this? But the question no longer needed an answer. It needed accountability. Richard had not moved, his eyes fixed on the open folder. Then lifting slowly to Naomi, his expression controlled, but no longer untouched. The certainty he carried earlier now replaced by something more complex, something that did not resolve easily. Who are you? He asked, the words measured, not dismissive this time, but deliberate, as if the answer mattered in a way it had not before. Naomi met his gaze fully now, not looking past him, not lowering her eyes, just meeting it with quiet clarity. Naomi Brooks, she said, and then, after a brief pause that settled into the room like a shift in gravity, external risk consultant, and the title did not need to be emphasized. It carried itself, landing with a weight that changed the way the room saw her, not gradually, but all at once. A faint movement passed through the group, a recalibration happening in real time, the memory of her earlier presence colliding with who she now was, creating a silence that no one filled. One of the analysts leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath, while another closed his laptop halfway, as if the need to prove something had already ended. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes too late to prevent what has already happened. Naomi did not step back, did not press forward. She simply stood there, the open folder between them, the truth laid out without performance, without accusation. And in that moment, the power in the room did not shift with volume or command. It shifted with clarity, with something that could not be undone, only acknowledged. The room did not return to its earlier rhythm. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in the numbers on the screen, but in the way every person at that table now understood what they were looking at and who was standing in front of them. The silence that followed Naomi's introduction was not empty. It was dense, filled with recalculations that had nothing to do with spreadsheets, only perception. One of the executives finally straightened in her chair, her voice careful now. If this analysis is correct, we are not just exposed. We are misaligned at the core of the agreement. And the words settled heavily, no longer debated, only processed. Naomi did not move, her posture still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said, and the rest was no longer hers to carry. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his gaze dropping once more to the open folder before lifting again, this time without the distance he had maintained. Earlier, his voice lower now, measured in a different way. Why did you not present this through proper channels? And the question, though calm, revealed something deeper, not authority, but an attempt to reframe what had already happened. Naomi's expression did not change, her answer steady. I did, she said simply, and the room held still again, the weight of that response settling in places no one could easily deflect. A faint shift passed across one of the analyst's faces, recognition, then discomfort, as if recalling something overlooked, an email, a report, a name dismissed too quickly. The woman at the table reached for her tablet again, scrolling rapidly now, searching, confirming, and then she paused, her fingers stilling as she found what she was looking for, her eyes lifting slowly toward Richard. There was a submission, she said, her tone careful. 6 months ago, flagged under external review. It was never escalated, and the words did not accuse, but they revealed. And that was enough. Richard's jaw tightened again, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to notice, the realization not just of a mistake, but of a pattern, of how easily something valuable had been dismissed because it did not arrive in the expected form. Naomi did not step forward, did not reclaim the space with force. She simply remained where she was, allowing the truth to expand without interruption, without urgency, and in doing so, she held more presence than any raised voice could have commanded. One of the executives closed her laptop fully now, leaning back as if the decision had already been made in a way that did not require a vote. We cannot proceed with this deal as structured, she said quietly, and no one argued, not because they agreed easily, but because they could no longer justify disagreement. The screen dimmed slightly as the presentation paused, the bright projections replaced by a muted reflection of the room itself, a room that looked different now, less certain, more exposed. Richard remained standing, his posture still controlled, but his silence no longer carried authority in the same way. It carried consequence, the kind that does not announce itself, but lingers. Naomi reached down then, closing the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound small but final, and for a brief moment, her gaze met Richard's again, not to challenge, not to claim anything, but to acknowledge what had already been understood, and then she turned slightly, as if preparing to step away, leaving behind not an argument, not a confrontation, but a truth that would continue to unfold long after she walked out of the room. No one stopped her as she turned, no one called her name. And that silence followed her more powerfully than anything spoken, stretching across the boardroom as Naomi walked toward the door with the same calm, measured steps she had entered with, the folder now closed at her side, its weight lighter not because the truth had changed, but because it no longer needed to be carried alone. Behind her, chairs shifted slightly, not in dismissal, but in adjustment, as if everyone in the room was recalibrating their place within something that had quietly but completely transformed. The screen remained dim, the numbers no longer the center of attention, replaced instead by the reflection of a room that had been forced to see itself more clearly than it intended. Richard did not move immediately, his gaze lingering on the space Naomi had just occupied, his posture still upright, But the stillness around him different now, no longer controlled, but contemplative, as if the absence of her presence had revealed more than her words ever could. His hand rested lightly against the table, fingers no longer tapping, no longer directing, just still, absorbing. Naomi reached the door and paused for a fraction of a second, her hand resting against the cool metal handle, the texture grounding, familiar, a quiet reminder of every moment she had walked through spaces like this unseen, unheard, and yet always observing. She did not look back right away, not because she was avoiding anything, but because she did not need to confirm what had already been understood. Then, slowly, she turned her head just enough for her gaze to meet the room one last time, not searching, not lingering, simply acknowledging, and in that brief exchange, something settled, not as closure, but as recognition. Richard met her eyes again, and this time there was no distance, no dismissal, only a quiet, unspoken understanding of what had been overlooked and what could no longer be. Naomi gave the slightest nod, not formal, not submissive, just a simple gesture of completion, then opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the soft click behind her marking the end of something that had begun long before this moment. The corridor felt still, almost untouched by what had just unfolded, the lights steady, the air cool, the building continuing its rhythm as if nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. She walked forward without hesitation,